Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Ashcombe, stood in the nursery doorway and watched two footmen carry her son's cradle down the stairs before the boy had been in the world a single hour. She did not call after them. She did not ask them to wait. She did not send word down to the study, where her husband sat with a letter open on his desk, and had not come up to see his son at all. She lifted the baby from the laundry basket he had been sleeping in for want of anything better, tucked his blanket square at the corners the way her own mother had taught her, and carried him to the window to watch the cradle loaded onto a cart in the rain, an heirloom leaving a house on the very hour it had gained an heir to sleep in. By the next evening there would be a plain wood cradle standing in that room instead, built by a man who owed the Vane name nothing. By the end of the year the county of Halishire would know precisely what the Duke of Ashcombe had sent away in that hour, and precisely what it cost him, a long time after, to want it back. The spring of 1817 had come to Halishire the way it always did, wet and unhurried, indifferent to whatever anyone in the county had planned around it. 2 years before that spring, Eleanor Bramwell had married Julian Vane, 7th Duke of Ashcombe, in a ceremony attended by 40 guests, and no affection anyone troubled to name aloud. Her father, Josiah Bramwell, a country solicitor who had spent 30 years turning other men's disorder into columns that balanced, had died that January owing nothing, and possessing little, and had left his only daughter a small annuity, a cottage in the village of Hollow Reach, and a habit of mind he had drilled into her since she was old enough to hold a pen. Written down, it's true, he used to say, tapping the ledger with 2 fingers. Spoken, it's only a claim. Write it down. Eleanor, the Duke of Ashcombe, had needed a wife who would not embarrass him, and would, in reasonable time, produce an heir. Eleanor had needed a roof that was not owed to anyone's charity. It was not a love match. Neither of them had pretended it was. But in the first year there had been small unlooked-for kindnesses, a book left by her chair, a horse chosen gentle enough for her to ride, and Eleanor had let herself believe, quietly, the way a person believes a thing they have decided not to say aloud, that the distance between them was only the distance of 2 strangers learning a shared house, and that it would close. It had not closed. It had, if anything, widened with the pregnancy, though she could not have said exactly when the closing door had become a habit rather than an accident. Julian Vane was a tall, contained man who ran Ashcombe's 11,000 a year and its 42 tenant farms with a competence that looked, from outside, like command, and was, up close, something closer to vigilance. He read every letter twice. He signed nothing without a witness. He kept in a locked drawer of his study a small portrait no one was permitted to ask about, of a boy who was not himself, and once, early in their marriage, when Eleanor had asked who it was, he had said only, "My brother," and closed the drawer, and she had understood from the particular stillness that followed. The stillness of a man standing very carefully on a floor he did not trust, that this was a door she was not yet invited through. What no one at Ashcombe seemed to notice in those 2 years was how much of the house ran because Eleanor Vane quietly made it run. The steward, Mr. Poole, was an honest man and a poor arithmetician, and it was Eleanor, evenings, who found his transposed figures and corrected them in a hand close enough to his own that no one asked questions, and returned the ledger to his desk before morning. It was Eleanor who remembered which tenant's roof had gone another winter unmended, and which widow's rent had quietly, without instruction, been forgiven. None of it bore her name. She had not asked it to. She had believed, in the way her father had taught her to believe in a column that balanced, that the sum of unspoken work would eventually be seen for what it was. She went into her labour on the 13th of March, a full fortnight before anyone expected it, in a house that had been uneasily full for 3 days, because Julian's cousin, Mr. Rafe Corbin, had arrived from London on an errand he described only as family business and had not yet left. Corbin was the son of Julian's late aunt, smooth-mannered, well turned out, and, until an heir was born and lived, next in the entail after Julian himself. He had a way of being warmest exactly when he wanted something, and Eleanor had disliked him from the first evening, quietly, the way one dislikes weather one cannot argue with. The labour was long. Mrs. Prudence Hatch, who had delivered half the infants in Hollow Reach parish and kept a private book recording the hour of every one of them, sat with Eleanor through the worst of it and noted in her own square hand the time the boy was born, 11 minutes past 4 in the morning, on the 14th of March, in the year 1817. She would swear to that hour, later before witnesses who had no reason to doubt her, and it would matter more than anyone in that room could have guessed. Julian was not in the room. That was not unusual. Men of his rank rarely were. What was unusual was that when the boy was washed and settled, and Mrs. Hatch sent a maid down with the news, the Duke of Ashcombe did not come up. He remained in his study with the door closed, and it was there, an hour before the birth, that a rider had delivered a letter addressed to him, in a hand he did not know, sealed with no crest, which Rafe Corbin had walked in to see him receive, and had stayed, with every appearance of sympathy, to watch him read. The letter claimed to be from a man in Bristol. It claimed an acquaintance with the Duchess of Ashcombe, of a kind no husband wishes to read about his wife. It named a night in June of the previous year, when Julian himself had been away 11 days at the enclosure hearings, and Eleanor had remained at Ashcombe, and it did the arithmetic a frightened man does without wanting to. 11 days in June. A child born in March. 9 months laid end to end like a debt come due. Julian Vane read it twice, the way he read everything, and did not notice, because grief and fear read the same as certainty, if a man does not stop to check, that he had stopped breathing normally somewhere in the second reading. He did not notice that Rafe Corbin's sympathy had the particular smoothness of a man who has rehearsed his face. He noticed only, with the flat, complete conviction of someone reliving a thing, rather than learning it new, that this was the exact shape of a story his own father had once told him, standing in a doorway very like this one, about a cradle and a child that had not, in the end, been permitted to stay. Below him, in the nursery, his son slept 11 minutes old in a basket lined with a housemaid's shawl, because no one had yet had the presence of mind to bring the family cradle down from the attic where it always stood ready. It did not matter. Julian had already sent for Poole. He was already giving, in a voice so level it did not sound like the voice of a man deciding anything at all. The order that would still be spoken of in Hallishire a full year later, and Eleanor, upstairs, holding a son not yet named, would hear it delivered to her own door before the sheets beneath her had gone cool. The order came to her by way of Mr. Poole, who stood in the nursery doorway turning his hat in both hands like a man handling something that might still burn him, and could not, for a long moment, make himself say it plainly. His Grace asks that he stopped. Started again. The cradle in the blue room, ma'am. The family one. He says it's to go back. Back where, Mr. Poole? Eleanor's voice did not rise. It did not need to. To the dower house, ma'am. To the attic there. He says Poole's hat turned once more in his hands. He says it goes back today. This hour, if it can be managed. Eleanor did not weep. She did not ask Poole to repeat himself, though she had heard him perfectly the first time. She did not send for her husband, though the study was 30 feet below her, and a strong voice would have carried the whole distance without effort. She looked down at her son, 11 minutes old and unbothered by any of it, and said, in a voice as even as her father's had ever been over a ledger, "Then it goes back, Mr. Poole. See that they're gentle with it on the stairs. It's 100 years old, and none of this is its fault." Poole went, visibly relieved to have been given something to do that was not an argument. Mrs. Hatch, folding linen at the far side of the room, did not look up, though her hands had gone very still, in the particular way of a woman who has delivered enough children to know exactly how much a house can hold in an hour, and is counting, silently, whether this one is about to exceed it. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed with her son against her shoulder, and allowed herself 10 minutes. She had done this once before, the week her father died. Sitting in his empty office, with his ledgers still open on the desk, had given herself a fixed span of time, counted on the mantel clock, to be simply and entirely a woman whose father had died, before she closed that feeling into the place she kept such things, and went back to the columns that needed finishing. She did the same now. 10 minutes, she told herself, watching the clock's minute hand crawl from the 8 to the 10. 10 minutes to be a woman whose husband had sent away her son's cradle before the boy had opened his eyes, and after that work. She did not cry through the 10 minutes, though her arms, holding the baby, ached with a tightness that had nothing to do with the labour behind her. What came instead was a kind of terrible clarity, the sort her father used to describe when a client finally stopped arguing with a set of figures and simply looked at them. She thought, without drama, in words as plain as anything in a ledger, "He believes I have shamed him, and he has decided this before he has asked me a single question. And a man who will not ask is a man who has already answered for himself." At the 10th minute she stood, laid her son back in the basket, and began, with hands that did not shake, to make a list. It was not a long list, it never needed to be. When she made one, her father had taught her that a true accounting was always shorter than people expected, because most of what people feared losing had never truly belonged to them in the first place. She owned, outright and beyond anyone's power to send back anywhere, the following: a cottage in Hollow Reach with 6 acres and a dairy of 11 cows, left to her free and clear by her father's will. An annuity of £40 a year, payable quarterly, that no marriage settlement had touched. A son, 11 minutes old, whose birth Mrs. Hatch had entered in her own hand and would swear to before any magistrate in the kingdom, and a mind that had spent 2 years quietly keeping a great house's accounts in order without once being thanked for it, which was, she thought, watching Poole's retreating back through the window, exactly the sort of mind a woman needed now. "Mrs. Hatch," she said, "I find I have decided something, and I should like your opinion of it, though I mean to do it regardless of what you say." Mrs. Hatch set down the linen. "Go on then, your grace. I am not staying in a house that sends my son's cradle away before it has troubled to ask me a single question about how he came to be here." Eleanor said it the way she might have reported a column that failed to balance, a fact, stated, requiring correction rather than mourning. "I mean to go to my father's cottage. Today, if the roads allow it, and if you will come with me until the boy is settled, I would be glad of it, and will pay you properly for your time, which is more than this house has troubled to do for a great many people. Mrs. Hatch, who had buried a husband, raised 4 children on a midwife's fees, and formed, across 30 years of parish confinements, opinions about the gentry she rarely voiced and never forgot, considered this for exactly as long as it took to fold the last sheet. "I'll come," she said, "and I'll tell you now, for what an old woman's word is worth. A man who sends a cradle back before he's asked a question is a man answering a fear that's older than the question. That's not the same as answering you. Don't mistake the two." "I don't intend to," Eleanor said, and began, with the same steady hands that had folded her son's blanket square an hour before, to pack. They left before dusk, in a hired cart because the ducal carriages were. Poole informed her with visible misery, not currently at her disposal without his Grace's word, and Eleanor had not troubled to send for his word. She carried her son wrapped against the March cold, a trunk of linens, her father's old writing box with its ledgers and pens, and nothing else that had come to her through the vain name. Mrs. Hatch rode beside her. Behind them, Ashcombe Hall stood lit in a handful of windows against the grey evening, already, though no one inside it had yet said so aloud. A house holding its breath. They stopped once, on the village green at Hollow Reach, outside the workshop of Tobias Reed, who had made half the furniture in the parish, and asked no questions he wasn't paid to ask. Eleanor climbed down stiffly, a day and some hours removed from childbed, and told him plainly what she needed. A cradle, plain, sturdy, ready by morning if it could be managed, and she would pay him from her own purse, and not a shilling of it would come from Ashcombe. Tobias Reed looked at the baby, and at the woman holding him with a straightness of spine that did not match the grey exhaustion in her face, and did not ask why a duchess was buying her own cradle from a village carpenter with dusk coming on. He only said 11 shillings, and I'll have it done by first light, ma'am, plain oak, no carving, if that suits. It suits, Eleanor said. Plain is exactly what I want. She said it simply, as a matter of the wood and nothing more. It would be some months before either of them understood how completely true it was, and how far the meaning of that plain oak cradle would travel before the story of it was finished. Bramwell Cottage had stood empty since Josiah Bramwell's death, its shutters closed, its small garden gone to weed. But the roof was sound, and the chimneys drew, and by the time Eleanor carried her son over its threshold the following morning, Tobias Reed's cart was already coming up the lane behind her, with the new cradle roped flat in the bed, plain oak. No carving, exactly as ordered. She set it in the front room, by the window that caught the morning light, and laid her son in it, and stood for a moment, with her hand flat on its rim, feeling the difference between an object built to prove a family's age and one built simply to hold a child safely through the night. The difference, she thought, was the whole of the argument, and she meant to spend however long it took proving it. Word travels through a small county the way water moves downhill, finding every low place without needing to be told where they are. And within a fortnight, everyone from the vicar to the miller's boy knew that the Duchess of Ashcombe had left the Hall with her infant son and taken up residence at her father's old cottage, and that his Grace had not, as of the 3rd week of March, made any journey to fetch her back. What they did not know, because Eleanor had not told them, and Mrs. Hatch, for all her plain speech, did not gossip about confinements, was why. The county filled the silence with its own guesses, most of them unkind to Eleanor, a few of them shrewd enough to wonder aloud what sort of man let a wife walk out with a 2-week-old heir and did nothing. Eleanor let them guess. She had 6 acres, a dairy going to ruin for want of management, an annuity that would not stretch far past midsummer if she did not put it to work, and a son to raise on the proceeds of her own competence rather than anyone's charity. Whatever the county thought of her, she intended, within the year, to give them a great deal more to think about than a departure. She began, the second week at Hollow Reach, by walking her father's dairy from end to end with his old ledger under her arm, totting figures the previous tenant had let slide for 2 seasons, and finding, in less than an afternoon, exactly where the trouble lay. The dairyman, a broad, taciturn man named Silas Marrow, who had worked the Bramwell land since before Eleanor was born, and had watched her leave for a duke's house with the particular scepticism of a man who has seen gentry marriages before, found her the next morning sitting at the kitchen table with his own delivery book spread beside her father's, and an expression he did not immediately trust. "You've been shorting yourself £6 a season on the Hollow Reach dairy contract, Mr. Marrow," she said, without preamble, "and I don't think you've noticed, because the miller's clerk who tallies the delivery weights has been rounding down and never up, which is not an accident a clerk makes 11 times running." Marrow set down the pail he was carrying. "That's so. It is. I've the figures here, if you'd like to see them, though I'd understand if you'd rather not trust a woman's arithmetic on the strength of her word alone." "Your father's arithmetic never wanted trusting twice," Marrow said. "I'll look at the figures." He looked at them for the better part of an hour, turning pages with the deliberate suspicion of a man who has been cheated before and expects. Eventually, to find the cheat sitting in the numbers he's been shown rather than the numbers he was owed. He did not find one. What he found instead was £6 a season, 3 years running, quietly gone to a mill clerk's thumb on the scale, and a young woman who had found it in an afternoon after 2 years spent, by all county account, doing nothing more strenuous than sitting in a duke's drawing-room. "I'll take it to the miller myself," Eleanor said, "if you'd rather not have the argument." "I find I don't mind an argument nearly as much as most people expect a duchess to." Marrow studied her for a long moment, the particular scrutiny of a working man, deciding whether a piece of gentry politeness is about to cost him something. "You do that," he said at last, "and I'll tell every dairyman from here to Marrowfield that the Bramwell girl caught a Hallowshire miller cheating with her father's dead ledger, and see how fast that travels." It travelled fast. By the end of April, Eleanor Vane had recovered £6 owed to a man who had never asked her for help, corrected a second miscount at the parish almshouse's coal account almost by accident, while helping the vicar's wife with an unrelated errand, and acquired without seeking it the beginnings of a reputation in Hollow Reach that had nothing to do with being a duchess and everything to do with being useful in a way that could be checked, verified, and repeated. Mrs. Hatch, staying on through the child's first weeks at Eleanor's insistence and expense, watched all of this with the flat approval of a woman who rarely gave any. "You're building something," she said one evening, watching Eleanor total the dairy figures by lamplight, with the baby asleep in his plain cradle at her elbow. "I don't know as His Grace understands yet what it is you're building. Men rarely do, until it's finished and standing where they can't pretend not to see it." "He isn't required to understand it," Eleanor said. "He's required eventually to ask me a question he should have asked in March. Everything else is simply how I intend to spend the time until he manages it." At Ashcombe Hall, 7 miles distant, the Duke of Ashcombe was managing considerably less than that. Poole, without Eleanor's evening corrections to quietly straighten his ledgers, had let 2 tenant disputes go unresolved into a 3rd week. a thing that had not happened once in the 2 years of her residence, and had begun, cautiously, to wonder aloud to the housekeeper whether her Grace mightn't be sent for on some ordinary household pretext. Since the accounts wanted her hand rather badly, and no one else's would do. Julian overheard this, once through a half-open door, and said nothing, and went back to his study, and sat for a long time with the locked drawer open and his brother's portrait in his hands, doing the particular arithmetic of a man beginning, very slowly, to suspect he has answered the wrong question. Rafe Corbin, for his part, watched the empty nursery and the unresolved tenant disputes, and the general quiet unravelling of a household that had, for 2 years, run with an efficiency no one had troubled to credit correctly, and found in all of it exactly the confirmation he wanted, that Eleanor's departure had cost the vain name nothing it could not survive, and that a little more patience, a little more careful smoothness, would see the entail settle where he had always believed it belonged. He did not yet know about the mill clerk's thumb on the scale, or the almshouse coal account, or the particular kind of reputation a woman builds when she is left with nothing to lose, and an aptitude for proving it. He would learn. May brought the county assizes, and with them the first crack in Rafe Corbin's smoothness, though no one at Ashcombe recognised it as such at the time. It came in the form of a letter, not the forged one, which had already done its work, but a second, ordinary one, addressed to Julian and left, by accident of a distracted footman, on the same tray as 3 others meant for the Duchess's forwarding address, which Poole, flustered and behind on everything since Eleanor's departure, sent to Hollow Reach without troubling to sort them. Eleanor did not open her husband's correspondence as a matter of course. She had never done so in 2 years of marriage, and did not intend to begin now that they were living apart. But the seal on this one was unfamiliar, a plain wax stamped with no crest, precisely, though she did not yet know it, the same seal that had arrived at Ashcombe the hour her son was born, and something in her father's trained eye for irregularity made her turn the letter over twice before setting it, unopened, on the mantel with a note pinned beneath it, not mine to read. Returning to Ashcombe by Tuesday's cart. She might have sent it back and thought no more of it, had Mrs. Hatch not glanced at the direction while dusting the mantel, and said, mildly, that's the same hand as was on the letter his Grace was reading, the morning the boy was born. I saw it over the footman's shoulder, going up with his tray. I've a memory for hands, ma'am, same as you've a memory for figures. Eleanor set down her pen very slowly. You're certain as I am of anything, and I've delivered enough letters in this county to know a stranger's hand from a familiar one at 20 paces. That letter came from Bristol, same as the first, I'd wager, though I couldn't say who from. Eleanor looked at the sealed letter on the mantel for a long moment, and did not open it. She had made herself a rule about other people's correspondence, and did not intend to break it for expedience, however tempting. But she did, before Tuesday's cart came, copy the direction, the postmark, and every visible detail of the seal into her father's old ledger, in a column headed. In her own neat hand, matters requiring proof, and beneath it, the date, and the words, a second letter, same hand as the first. Find who sends them, and why. It was the first entry in what would become, over the following 2 months, the single most consequential piece of bookkeeping Hallishire had seen in a generation, though on the May evening she wrote it. It was only a woman with a lamp and a ledger, refusing to let a single loose thread of paper pass her by unrecorded, exactly as her father had taught her to do with every column that did not yet balance. Julian Vane did not come to Hollow Reach in May, or in the first 3 weeks of June, though he thought of little else. In the particular way a man thinks of a door he has told himself he is not permitted to open. What kept him from it was not indifference. The household, watching him grow thinner and quieter by the week, had long since stopped believing that story, but the same wound that had sent the cradle away in the first place, and it was in June, at last, that the shape of that wound surfaced fully enough for anyone else to see it. It surfaced because Mrs. Winch, the Ashcombe housekeeper, had served the family for 31 years, and had grown too old and too tired of watching a good man ruin himself to hold her tongue any longer. She found Julian in the locked study one evening, the portrait out again, and said, without being asked, "You're doing it again, Your Grace. Same as your father did." Julian did not look up. "I don't know what you mean." "You do. I was housemaid here the year it happened, and I've never forgotten it, though God knows the family's tried to make sure no one else remembers." Mrs. Winch came further into the room, an old woman's version of courage, which does not tremble the way a young one's does. "Your father had a second son, Peter, born the year after you, and by every account a sweet ordinary child, no different from any other. And your father got it into his head, on no more than a rumour, a jealous cousin's whisper, much the same as I dare say is happening again now, though I'll not say more on that the boy wasn't his. He sent the cradle back the very week Peter was born. Sent the boy off to be fostered in Devon within the month, out of sight, so he needn't look at what he'd decided to believe. Peter died of a fever at 6 years old, in a stranger's house, having never once slept a night under this roof as his father's acknowledged son. Your father lived the rest of his life a smaller man for it, and never once in my hearing admitted he'd been wrong, though everyone who knew the family knew it plainly enough. Julian's hands, on the desk, had gone very still. "I was 8, he said finally. "I remember the cradle going. I didn't understand why. I only understood that whatever had happened, it could happen to anyone in this house, and that my father decided it in an afternoon, and never once asked a single question of anyone who might have told him the truth. And now you've done the very same thing, Mrs., Winch said, not unkindly, to a woman who never in 2 years gave you a single reason to doubt her, on the word of a letter from a stranger, and the sympathy of a cousin who stands to gain everything if you keep believing it. I'll say no more, Your Grace. I've said more already than a housekeeper ought. But you asked me once, years ago, why I never spoke of Peter, and I told you it wasn't my place. It's past being anyone's place to stay quiet now, I think, with another child's cradle sent back before he's a day in the world. She left him alone with the portrait and the locked drawer, and Julian Vane sat a long time in the failing evening light, understanding at last, with the particular sickened clarity of a man recognising his own father's face in a mirror he had not meant to look into, that he had not been protecting Ashcombe from shame at all. He had been repeating, exactly, gesture for gesture, the one act of his childhood he had sworn, at 8 years old, standing in a nursery doorway, watching a cradle carried away, that he would never commit himself. He did not go to Hollow Reach that night. He was not yet ready, and some honest part of him knew that arriving unready would cost more than waiting a little longer to arrive correctly. But he wrote, for the first time in 3 months, a single line on a fresh sheet of paper, and sat looking at it for the better part of an hour before he sealed it. I have been asking the wrong question since March. I should like, if you will permit it, to ask you the right one. J. He sent it by his own hand, riding to Hollow Reach himself rather than trusting it to Poole, and left it with Mrs. Hatch at the cottage gate rather than knocking, because he did not yet trust himself to see his son's face and remain as composed as he intended to be. It was, Eleanor thought, reading it by lamplight after the house had gone quiet, the first honest sentence her husband had written her in 2 years of marriage, and she did not answer it that night, or the next, because she had a rule about proof that she did not intend to abandon for a single well-turned line, however long she had waited to read one. She answered it on the 3rd day, in 4 words, in her own hand, and sent it back by the same route it had come. Show me. Not tonight. Julian came to Hollow Reach on the last Sunday in June, and Eleanor, watching him from the cottage window walk up the lane on foot rather than by carriage, hatless, in a coat that had clearly been chosen for walking rather than for effect, understood before he reached the gate that whatever he had come to say, he had at least troubled to arrive as a man rather than as a duke, and that this, small as it was, counted for something. She met him in the front room rather than the garden, with the plain oak cradle standing by the window exactly where it had stood since March, their son asleep in it, 4 months old now, and entirely unconcerned with the weight of the conversation about to happen over his head. Julian's eyes went to the cradle first. She saw it happen. The particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, cataloguing 11 shillings worth of plain oak against 100 years of vain mahogany, and finding the accounting entirely, humiliatingly, in the plain oak's favour, and then to the boy, and then, at last, to her. "I have not come to ask you back," he said. "I understand that would be presumptuous of me, and I have not earned the asking. I have come to tell you what I should have told you in March, before I gave an order I had no right to give on the strength of a letter I never troubled to question." "Then tell me," Eleanor said, and sat, and did not offer him a chair, which he noted and did not remark upon. He told her plainly, no rehearsed courtliness in it, none of the smooth self-defence she had half braced for, about the letter, about Corbyn's presence in the room when he read it, about the arithmetic of 11 days in June against a birth in March, that had felt, in the moment, like certainty, rather than the panic it actually was. He told her, haltingly, about his father, and Peter, and the cradle sent back a generation before hers, and the fever in Devon, and the small permanently diminished man his father had become for never once admitting the shape of his own mistake. "I am not telling you this to be forgiven," he said. "I am telling you because I have only just understood it myself, and you are owed the whole of it. Badly told as I am telling it, rather than a tidier version I might manage with more practice." Eleanor listened without interrupting, the particular discipline of a woman who has learned that the fastest way to hear the truth in full is to let a man exhaust his own excuses before asking her question. When he finished, she said only, "That is an explanation, Julian. It is not yet an apology. And I find I want both, and I want them kept separate, because a man who apologizes by explaining himself has usually found a way to make the explaining do the apology's work for it, and I don't intend to let that happen here." Julian's jaw worked once, and he said, quietly, then, "I am sorry. Not for the letter deceived me, and I mean to find out who sent it and why, and I believe I have some notion already, though I'll not accuse a man on a notion, having just learned what that costs. I am sorry for what I did with it. I sent away 100-year-old cradle before I had held my own son for a single minute on nothing but fear dressed up as certainty, and I did it to a woman who has never in 2 years given me one honest reason to doubt her, and I will carry that regardless of anything you decide to do with me now." "All right," Eleanor said. It was not forgiveness. Both of them understood that. She watched him understand it, watched the small flinch of a man who had perhaps hoped, despite himself, for more than 2 words. But it was, she thought, a beginning honestly arrived at, which was worth considerably more than a tidy ending dishonestly rushed. "Show me," she said again, over time, not with words tonight, however well you've managed the words tonight. I mean to stay here until I have something to see rather than something to hear. And in the meanwhile, Julian, I should like your help with a matter of business, since you are here, and since I think you owe me the use of your name for it, if nothing else yet. Anything, he said. I want to know who else has received a letter in that hand, and I want to know it from paper, not from anyone's memory of what they think they recall. I have started a ledger. I should like you to help me finish it. Julian looked at her for a long moment, the particular look, she thought, of a man realizing that the woman he had spent 2 years failing to see clearly had, in the 4 months since he lost the right to her company, built something formidable enough to require his help rather than his protection, and said, "Show me the ledger." She showed him. It was the first evening in 4 months they sat at the same table, and though neither of them said so aloud, both of them understood it as the moment the charged object of the whole affair quietly changed hands. Not the cradle, which stayed exactly where it stood by the window, but the ledger itself, her father's careful discipline, turned now toward a single forged letter, and the man who had sent it, with Julian's name and Julian's resources placed, for the first time, entirely at her direction rather than his own. The ledger grew through July with the patient, unglamorous thoroughness of an audit rather than the drama of a discovery, which was, Eleanor had long since learned from her father, precisely how the truest accountings were always built. Julian rode to Bristol twice, at her direction, and returned each time with fragments rather than answers, the innkeeper, who recalled no gentleman of the description given in the forged letter, staying at the address named in it during the week in question. A stationer who, shown a scrap of the letter's paper by Julian's solicitor, frowned at the watermark pressed faintly into its corner, and said he could not be certain, but that the mark looked to him like Hartley's millwork, and Hartley's, to his knowledge, had not begun selling that particular grade until the autumn, some months after the letter's claimed June date. It was Mr. Aldous Crane, the Ashcombe solicitor, precise and procedural, in a way Eleanor found she trusted instinctively, who turned the stationer's uncertain memory into something closer to proof. He wrote to Hartley's mill directly, over his own seal, and received back, within a fortnight, a ledger extract, a document, Eleanor noted with something close to satisfaction, meeting a document, exactly as her father would have approved, confirming that the grade of paper in question had first left the mill's premises on the 9th of October, a full 4 months after the letter claimed to have been written on it. "It is not proof of who sent it," Crane said, laying the extract on Eleanor's kitchen table beside the ledger she had been keeping since May. "But it is proof the letter cannot have been written when it claims to have been written, which is very nearly as useful, since it means whoever composed it either mistook the date or never troubled to check it. And men who forge letters for money rarely make so careless an error unless they are working in haste, or unless someone in this county sold them paper they believed was older than it was," Eleanor said, "which narrows the question considerably, since there are only 2 stationers within a day's ride who stock Hartley's grade, and I have already written to both. The second stationer, in the market town of Marrowfield, remembered the sale precisely, because it had been an unusual one. A gentleman he did not recognise, well dressed, paying in coin rather than credit, purchasing a small quantity of paper and sealing wax with no crest. In the second week of March, a full 9 days, Eleanor noted in her ledger with the particular satisfaction of a column finally closing before her son was born, and easily enough time for a letter to be composed, carried, and delivered to arrive on the very afternoon it did. The gentleman had given no name. But the stationer, pressed gently by Crane as to any detail he might recall, remembered that the buyer had asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the shop also carried mourning stationery, black-bordered, of the kind ordered by families anticipating a death. A strange question from a stranger. The stationer had thought at the time, and had not connected it to anything since, until a solicitor's letter arrived, asking him to search his memory for exactly such strangeness. Eleanor sat with that detail for a long evening, turning it in her mind the way her father used to turn a stubborn figure, before she understood what it meant. A man buying mourning stationery in the second week of March was not a man anticipating a stranger's death. He was a man who believed, or hoped, that a birth in that house might shortly become something to mourn instead of celebrate, that the child, once declared no true heir, might be sent away as Peter had been sent away, quietly, to fade from the family's account within a few uncertain years, and that the paper bought that week might, in time, serve 2 purposes rather than 1. "It's Corbin," she said aloud to the empty kitchen, and found she was not surprised, only satisfied, in the particular flat way of a woman confirming an answer she had suspected for months, and had simply, patiently, refused to write down until the proof matched it. She was not alone in reaching that conclusion. Rafe Corbin, watching from Ashcombe, where he had remained, on one pretext after another, through the whole of that summer, had begun, by late July, to sense the particular cooling in Julian's manner toward him that comes when a man has started, quietly and without announcement, to suspect someone he has not yet decided how to accuse. Corbin was not a fool. He understood that solicitors' letters to Bristol innkeepers and stationers did not travel for idle reasons. And he understood, better than most, exactly how thin the thread was that connected him to a plain wax seal and a paper mill's shipping date. He did what a cornered, deniable man does. He moved to secure his weakest link before anyone else could reach her first. The weakest link was Sally Ames, a housemaid at Ashcombe who had been persuaded, the previous autumn, with promises of a place in a London household and a sum of money she had badly needed, to tell anyone who asked that she had once seen a strange gentleman leaving the Duchess's rooms by the garden door on a night in June, a lie she had told exactly once to Corbin's own steward, months before the forged letter was ever composed, laying the ground for it in advance the way a careful man lays a foundation before he builds. Corbin went to Sally in the first week of August in the Ashcombe kitchen garden and offered her a considerably larger sum to leave for Ireland within the week. On a boat he had already, with his usual smoothness, arranged, he framed it as an opportunity. Sally, 19 years old and increasingly sick with the guilt of a lie that had, over the summer, grown from an abstract favour into something attached to a real infant she had held, once, in the nursery before it all began, did not take the boat. She went instead, on a wet evening in the second week of August, to Bramwell Cottage, on foot 7 miles, arriving after dark with her shawl soaked through, and asked, trembling, to speak to the Duchess alone. "I told a lie," she said, before Eleanor had even closed the door behind her. and I've been made to feel it grow heavier every week since, and I'd rather be turned out without a character than carry it another day. If you'll only hear me before Mr. Corbin finds out I've come." Eleanor sat her by the fire, sent for tea she did not touch herself, and listened, without a single interrupting word, to the whole of it. The promise of a London place, the money already half spent on a sister's debt, the lie told to Corbin's steward the previous autumn, months before any letter existed, precisely so that a letter, when it did arrive, would find a servant's word already waiting to support it. "You understand," Eleanor said gently, when the girl had finished, "that what you've just told me means Mr. Corbin was planning this before my son was even conceived. Not in March when the letter came. Last autumn." "I understand it now, ma'am," Sally said, and began at last to cry, the first tears shed by anyone at all in the whole affair. And Eleanor let her cry without hurrying her, because there was a difference, she had always believed, between the composure required of the wronged, and the composure that ought never be demanded of the merely frightened and guilty and young. "You'll swear to this before a magistrate," Eleanor said, when the girl was calmer. "Not for my sake alone, for your own. A confession given freely before anyone forces it from you is worth a great deal more than one dragged out after the fact, and I think you know that, or you wouldn't have walked 7 miles in the rain to give it to me first." Sally swore to it 3 days later, before Mr. Carr, Crane and a clerk, in a statement that placed the beginning of Rafe Corbin's design a full 6 months before the letter that had emptied a nursery cradle in an hour, and Eleanor added the date to her ledger, in the column headed matters requiring proof, and drew beneath it for the first time since March a single clean line, the mark her father had always made when a column finally, completely, closed. The Michaelmas Quarter-Day Assembly at Marrowfield drew, as it did every year, the whole working breadth of the county. Tenant farmers come to pay rents and hear disputes settled, tradesmen with accounts to square, the magistrate Sir Barnaby Fitch presiding over the small public business that could not wait for the assizes proper. It was, Eleanor had judged with her father's old instinct for where a truth would carry farthest, exactly the room in which to finish what a plain wax seal had started in March. Not a private drawing-room where a scandal could be smoothed over by rank, but a public hall full of people who kept their own accounts and understood, better than any peer of the realm, what a forged column of figures looked like once it was laid open. She came with Julian beside her, his own choice, offered and accepted without ceremony the week before, and with Mr. Crane, and with a folder of documents she had spent 5 months assembling one patient entry at a time. Rafe Corbin was present too, seated near the front with the easy confidence of a man who did not yet know precisely how much ground had shifted beneath him. And it was he, ironically, who rose first, when the ordinary business of rents was cleared, to raise, in a voice pitched for the whole room, the delicate matter of the Ashcombe succession, and whether it oughtn't. In fairness to the family name, be formally examined. "I will examine it gladly," Eleanor said, rising before Sir Barnaby had finished inviting comment, and the room, which had not expected the Duchess herself to answer, went very still. "I have brought the examination with me, in fact, since Mr. Corbin has been so good as to raise it publicly rather than in whispers, which will save us all a great deal of time." She laid the documents before the magistrate one at a time, in the order her ledger had assembled them, and read each into the record herself plainly, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her a true account should always be read. Mrs. Hatch's birth register, kept these 30 years and never once disputed. recording her son's birth at 11 minutes past 4 in the morning on the 14th of March. The stationer's sworn statement and the mill's shipping ledger behind it, proving the forged letter's paper, had not existed in the county until months after the date it claimed. The innkeeper's statement that no gentleman answering the letter's description had lodged where it claimed. And last, Sally Ames's confession, sworn before Crane and a clerk, dating Corbyn's design to the previous autumn, before the child that was meant to be doubted had even been conceived. A man cannot forge a letter on paper that does not yet exist, Eleanor said, into the particular silence that had settled over the hall, the silence of a room recalculating everyone in it at once. And a scheme cannot begin the same week as the crime it claims to expose, if a servant's sworn word places its beginning half a year earlier. I do not ask this room to take my account of my own conduct, sirs. I have not offered one. I have offered only what can be checked against paper that exists independently of me, which is, I think, the only kind of account any of us ought to trust. Sir Barnaby Fitch, a precise and unhurried man not given to theatre, examined each document in turn, questioned Sally Ames directly and at length, and questioned, last, Rafe Corbyn himself, whose smoothness, tested at last against documents rather than sympathy, began, visibly, to crack, a stammered explanation of the morning stationery that satisfied no one, a claim of ignorance regarding Sally Ames that collapsed the moment Crane produced the steward's own account of the previous autumn's conversation. It was Tobias Reed, unbidden, who delivered the final, unlooked-for weight. He had come to Marrowfield only to settle his own quarter accounts, and rose from the back of the hall, hat in hand, to say that he had, in March, built a plain oak cradle for the Duchess of Ashcombe on a single day's notice, and that in the 5 months since he had watched half the county come round to admiring a woman who had walked out of a duke's house, with nothing but her son and her father's ledgers, and built, from a village cottage, a reputation no forged letter could touch, and that he, for one, did not see how a man who'd spent a year plotting a child's ruin deserved to be believed over a woman who'd spent it, in full public view, simply proving her worth over and over until there was nothing left to prove. The room's turning, when it came, was not loud. There was no shout, no gavel struck in outrage. It was quieter than that, and more complete, a slow settling of expression across 40 faces at once, farmers and tradesmen, who had watched Eleanor Vane correct a mill clerk's thumb on the scale and audit an almshouse's coal account, exchanging glances that required no words, while Rafe Corbyn sat very still in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who understands, all at once, that every door in the room has quietly closed behind him. Sir Barnaby found, on the documents before him, sufficient cause to refer the matter of forgery to the assizes, and asked Eleanor, as was his right, what she wished the court to know of her own preference in the matter. "I would ask for restraint," Eleanor said. "Not because Mr. Corbyn has earned it, but because I have spent 5 months building something I would rather not spend the next 5 tearing down in a public trial that will cost my son's name more than it costs Mr. Corbyn's, since scandal always falls heaviest on the smallest shoulders in the room. I ask that he make full restitution to Sally Ames for the wages he promised and never delivered, that he sign, before this magistrate, a full written confession to be held against him, should he ever again come within the boundary of this county, and that he take passage abroad within the month, at his own expense, and not return. That is mercy, Sir Barnaby, not softness. I could ask for considerably more, and everyone in this room knows it. I am choosing not to, because I have found this year that a woman who can afford to be merciful has usually already won the argument that matters most. It was granted, largely as she asked, and Rafe Corbin left Marrowfield that afternoon a smaller man than he had entered it, in every sense that county society measured smallness, while Eleanor Vane walked out of the hall beside her husband, past 40 tenants and tradesmen who had, within the space of 1 quarter-day, quietly and permanently recalibrated everything they believed about her, and understood, walking, that the wound line spoken over her son's cradle in March had at last been answered in the only currency her father had ever taught her to trust: paper, checked, and found to balance. They did not return to Ashcombe Hall together that same evening. Eleanor had said, months before, that she meant to have something to see rather than something to hear before she considered coming home, and she held to it even now, with Corbin gone, and the county's verdict plainly hers. It was 2 weeks later, on a quiet evening at Bramwell Cottage, with the harvest already well in, and the light going gold and long across the garden, that Julian asked for the conversation she had been waiting 5 months to have in full. "I owe you an explanation and an apology," he said, "and you told me once that I am not permitted to let one do the other's work. I gave you the explanation in June. I should like now to give you the apology properly, without a single excuse folded into it." "Go on," Eleanor said, and did not offer him a chair this time either, though she noticed, and was glad of it, that he no longer seemed to expect one. "I am sorry," Julian said, "for believing a stranger's letter over 5 years of watching you be exactly. Unfailingly honest in every small matter a man has the chance to observe honesty in, if he troubles to look. I am sorry I did not trouble to look. I am sorry I gave an order that hour that I would have refused to give if I had waited 1 single day to ask you a question instead of a cousin's opinion. And I am sorry that the fear I answered instead of you was never really about you at all. It was about a brother I lost before I understood I was allowed to grieve him, and a father who taught me that doubt was safer than trust, and I let that teaching run my house for 2 years without once examining whether it was true. It was not true. You have spent this whole year proving, in every ledger and every county in this shire, exactly how untrue it was." "All right," Eleanor said again, and this time it carried a different weight than it had in June, and Julian heard the difference, and did not press her further, because he had learned, finally, the patience the whole year had been teaching him. "I have conditions," she said, "if you mean what you've said, and I believe that you do. I will return to Ashcombe, but the nursery is mine to govern without appeal. No order concerning my son passes without my word on it, not yours alone, not ever again. The estate ledgers will carry my name beside Poole's, openly, not corrected in secret at midnight the way I have been doing for 2 years without credit. And when you are afraid of something, Julian, you will say so to my face before you act on it, however unmanly it feels to admit fear aloud, because a man who acts first and explains after has already cost us both more than either of us can afford to keep paying." "All right," Julian said. "All right, then. Then we are agreed," Eleanor said. "We are agreed," he said, and it was, in the plain, unornamented way of 2 people who had already spent a whole year proving their words in documents rather than declarations, the entire treaty they required. They returned to Ashcombe together the following week, and the county, watching the ducal carriage come up the drive with the Duchess and her son inside it, for the first time in 6 months, understood without needing to be told that whatever verdict Marrowfield had rendered in the magistrates' hall, the truer one had been rendered here, in the slow accumulation of a single year's proof. The autumn that followed was not, Eleanor found, a season of grand gestures, and she was glad of it, because grand gestures had never been what she asked for. It was instead a season of small ones, repeated often enough that even Mrs. Winch, watching from 31 years of service, began to remark on it. Julian moving his chair beside Eleanor's at breakfast rather than across from her, without comment, as though it had always stood there. Julian pouring her tea before she asked for it, having finally troubled to learn how she took it. Julian bringing the estate ledgers to her openly in the evenings, not to be corrected in secret, but to be gone over together. Her hand and his side by side in the same column, both names now entered, where once only Poole's uncertain figures had stood alone. None of it, Eleanor knew, meant very much in isolation. A moved chair was only a chair. Poured tea was only tea. But her father had taught her, once, watching a stubborn set of accounts finally begin to balance after years of small unremarked corrections, that nothing in a true ledger ever proved itself in a single entry. It proved itself in accumulation, sum by patient sum, until the total became impossible to argue with. She began, that autumn, to keep no record of Julian's small kindnesses at all, which was, for a woman who had spent her whole life writing everything down, the truest sign of how thoroughly she had begun to trust them. There was one evening, in late October, when the old habit surfaced again. A tenant's cottage roof had failed in a storm, and Julian, hearing of it at breakfast, gave the order to Poole directly, unilaterally, exactly as he had always done before March, send the estate carpenter, repair it by week's end, settle the cost from the general fund, and it was only that evening, going over the ledger together, that Eleanor set down her pen and looked at him. "You gave that order alone this morning," she said, not unkindly but plainly, "without asking me, though I was sitting across the table from you when the news came." Julian went still. "I didn't think, that's precisely it," Eleanor said. "You didn't think, because for 2 years not thinking to ask me was simply how this house ran. And old habits return exactly when a man is least watching for them. I'm not angry. I'm telling you plainly, because that's the agreement, and because a habit named calmly is a habit a man can still correct." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right. I'll go to Poole in the morning and have the order stand as it should have stood, from both of us, or not at all." And he did, without being asked twice, and Eleanor understood, watching him do it, that this was the relapse the whole year had been quietly testing for, and that he had passed it, not by never slipping, but by correcting cleanly the moment it was named. It was on an ordinary evening in November, no anniversary, no occasion, that Julian said the thing Eleanor had been waiting, without admitting she was waiting, to hear properly said. They were in the nursery, their son nearly 9 months old now, and pulling himself upright against the rim of the plain oak cradle that still stood, unmoved, exactly where Tobias Reed's cart had left it in March. "I would choose you," Julian said, watching the boy rather than her, which she understood by now as his particular way of saying the hardest things, "not because I need an heir secured, and not because the county has decided I ought to. I have been choosing you, quietly, every week since June, in every small thing I've done since, whether or not I said so aloud. I am only now troubling to say it aloud, because you taught me this year that things unspoken tend to be mistaken, eventually, for things that were never true at all, and I don't want that mistake made about this." "All right," Eleanor said, and reached for his hand, and did not let go of it, and understood, holding it, that this was the moment she had been rationing, all year, without naming it as a ration at all, and that she was, for the first time since March, willing to let the grief she had filed so carefully away finally come due in full, not because anything more had broken, but because everything, at last, had mended enough to bear the weight of feeling it honestly. She cried that night, once, briefly, entirely, with Julian's hand still in hers, and did not count the minutes. 2 years passed, and Hallishire, as counties do, folded the whole affair into its ordinary memory, retold at harvest suppers, with the particular fondness the county reserved for a story that had ended the right way. Rafe Corbin remained in Italy, where his confession and his passage had sent him, and sent, twice a year, without fail, the restitution payments his written confession obliged him to, arriving at Ashcombe with the flat regularity of a debt finally being honestly paid. Sally Ames, given a character and a small settlement by Eleanor's own hand, rather than sent away in disgrace, married a Marrowfield tradesman the following spring, and named her first daughter, with a sentiment she never fully explained to anyone but Mrs. Hatch, Eleanor, Silas Marrow's dairy, run now on terms Eleanor had set, and Julian had ratified across the whole Ashcombe estate, paid every tenant farmer the full honest weight of what they delivered, with a standing notice posted at the estate office each quarter listing the figures plainly, for any man to check against his own reckoning, a practice the county had begun, by the second year, to call simply the Ashcombe accounting, and 1-2 neighbouring estates had quietly begun copying. Tobias Reed's workshop, patronised openly now by the ducal household for every ordinary piece of furniture it required, had taken on 2 apprentices and could not keep pace with its orders. And in the village of Hollow Reach, in the front room of what was still called, by everyone, the Bramwell cottage, a small school met 3 mornings a week, funded from Eleanor's own annuity and Julian's matching purse, teaching sums and letters to any child in the parish whose family could not otherwise afford it, an institution, Eleanor liked to say, built on the belief that a column taught early enough would go on balancing a whole life through. The ancestral cradle came back to Ashcombe that second autumn, retrieved at last from the dower house attic where it had stood untouched for 2 years, at Julian's own instruction, given to the same footman who had carried it away. "Send it back," he told him, nodding at the crate, and the footman, who had heard those exact words once before, under very different circumstances, hesitated only a moment before understanding that this time they meant the opposite of everything they had meant in March. Up to the nursery. It needn't be used for anything. It can stand in the corner and gather dust for all I care, so long as it stands where my son can see it and know, when he's old enough to ask, that nothing in this house was ever sent away because of him again. It stood, in the end, in the corner exactly as he'd said, polished but empty, 100 years of vain mahogany kept now as a monument rather than a throne. The plain oak cradle stood beside it, closer to the window, holding by then a second child, a daughter born that spring in a house that had, by every account anyone in it could give, long since stopped holding its breath. Visitors to the nursery, seeing the 2 cradles side by side, sometimes asked, politely, why the family kept the plain one so prominently displayed, when the ancestral piece so plainly outranked it in age and craft. Eleanor answered them all the same way, without heat, the way she answered any figure she had long since finished proving. That one, she would say, nodding at the plain oak, was there when it mattered. This house has learned to value that above every other kind of pedigree it owns. She did not weep at her son's birth, and she did not weep the hour his cradle was carried away. And she did not weep at Marrowfield with 40 faces, turning slowly toward the truth she had spent a year assembling. She wept once, in November, in a nursery with her husband's hand in hers, having finally been given a reason to let the grief she had rationed all year come fully, gently, and only once, due. That was not weakness. It had never once, in the whole of that year, been mistaken for weakness by anyone who troubled to watch closely enough. It was, her father would have told her, simply a column closing at last, honestly, after a long correct accounting, and a woman does not weep, in the end, because she has been defeated. She weeps because the sum, finally checked and rechecked, and found true, has come out exactly as it should have all along. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, patiently, one ledger and one honest season at a time, impossible to unsee. And that, unlike a cradle, unlike a name, unlike even a house's long-held breath, was not a thing that could ever again be sent back.